Morning Year 10. Today we're going to look at two poems which are mainly based on the theme of power, and those poems are My Last Duchess by Robert Browning and Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. As usual, in talking about these poems, hopefully we will make sure that you understand the poems for Assessment Objective 1 and you're able to select relevant quotations. We're going to talk about different methods of language, structure, form and sound devices used by the poets for Assessment Objective 2, and we're going to think about the links between these poems and their historical and social contexts for Assessment Objective 3. So our big question for today is, how is the power of man presented in My Last Duchess and Ozymandias? So that's different to poems like Storm on the Island and Extract from the Prelude, which focused more so on the power of nature. So in looking at the power of mankind, we're going to make sure that you revise these two poems in detail. We're going to think about the two poems in comparison to one another, and we're going to analyse the range of methods used, including the more difficult methods linked to structure and sound to enable pupils to access grade 7 and above. If we start by looking at the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, the title is very good for analysis on its own. The Duchess mentioned in the title is clearly no longer present, and it's suggested that she has been or she will be soon replaced. Secondly, the title implies that the Duke of Ferrara, who is the voice of this poem, is patriarchal, so he believes that men should have the authority in a relationship, and he saw the Duchess as his property, proven by the word my. And thirdly, the title suggests that power is going to be the main theme, because the voice of the poem is a duke, and a duke obviously is part of the aristocracy, so he has a high position in society. If you want to actually analyse the language within the title, then you would look at that word my and identify it as a possessive pronoun. So that immediately indicates that the Duke objectified his wife. He sees her as just another one of his prized possessions, because material goods seem to be quite important to him in the poem. He's got lots of artwork and expensive sculptures. Now, if you wanted to talk about the word last, it also implies that the Duchess may have been part of a long line of previous wives, all of whom are no longer part of the Duke's life, which in itself arouses suspicion, because we wonder what's happened to them or why the Duke can't actually keep a wife for very long. Now in the poem, it's later implied that the Duke has had the Duchess referred to in the title killed due to his jealousy, which becomes apparent later. If you want to talk about the historical context of this poem, then it does actually centre upon the real 16th century Italian Duke of Ferrara. Now Ferrara was a region in Italy, and this Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso, married the 14-year-old Lucrezia di Cosimo de' Medici when he was 25. Now, at the age of 17, so 3 years later, Lucrezia mysteriously died, and there were rumours that she'd been poisoned. Now, it seems more likely nowadays, with medical evidence, that she died of tuberculosis. However, Robert Browning uses the rumour that she was poisoned to inspire this poem. Now, the poem is a dramatic monologue, meaning we only ever get to hear the words of the Duke. So we only get this biased account of events. And within this biased account, it's implied that indeed he did order her death, and that the very sinister line, "I gave commands," reinforces that, because he seemed to feel that she was disrespecting him by flirting with other men. Now, we know by now that being able to look at patterns of words or semantic fields is really effective, and it helps minimise the number of quotations you have to learn. So if you were to pick out the words disgusts, lessened and commands from the poem My Last Duchess, you can see that Browning is using a semantic field of language linked to power and authority. And it reinforces the Duke being incredibly patriarchal, and he thinks that he has ultimate power and control in his relationships, simply because he's a man. Now, if you analyse some of the words individually, you would look at the verb lessened, and it implies that the Duke regarded the young Lucrezia as being inferior to him, almost like a pupil in need of educating about the ways of being a good wife. So that suggests that he sees himself as a source of wisdom, someone that she should look up to for inspiration. So it's quite arrogant of him. Now, her waywardness, which he mentions in the poem, and by that I mean the fact that she seems to disobey, effectively, some of his commands, it makes her quite a reluctant pupil. And as a result, lots of things that she does actually disgust him. And that verb suggests that he's repelled by her. And that's because she's difficult to control, and he finds that offensive. Now, in retaliation to that, it's implied that the commands that he gave were actually orders to have her murdered. And that's the only way, his last resort, of getting her to submit to his will. Now, if we look at assessment objective 3, the historical context, we can see that, and we know from history, that having removed Lucrezia from the situation, the Duke then proceeded to organise his next marriage. So the poem is actually a dramatic monologue addressed to the envoy, or the messenger, of the Count of Tyrol, whose daughter the Duke wants to wed next. So it just proves how easily replaceable these women are, the Duke's wives are. They're like commodities, like possessions that he gets rid of once he's bored of them. And it just reinforces how powerful financial security and status can make you, so you can pick and choose people and get rid of them when they've served their purpose. But it's ironic because the Duke can never seem to find genuine happiness or true love. So irrespective of all that money and power, he can never find the one thing that makes him truly happy. Okay, so if we move on to the imagery used in the poem, the best quotation to look at would be, "Notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse," right at the end of the poem. Now, Browning uses a metaphor here, and it's apparently to show off the Duke's material wealth, the fact that he's got this statue in bronze. So he's showing off to the Count's envoy about how wealthy he is and what a good prospect of a husband he is. Now, it would seem that the Duke also, however, seems to feel an affinity with Neptune, who was the Roman god of the sea, so he thinks that he's similar to him. Now, Neptune would have had a whole bevy of sea creatures under his control. He had the sea as his empire, the empire which he controlled. So that implies that the Duke also feels that he has women and his inferiors under his control, and that they are all submissive to him. So therefore the readers and Browning can see that this is heavily ironic, because we know in fact that the Duke's followers, including his wives, seem not to be wholly obedient to him. Now, if we wanted to stretch it a little bit further, we could link it to historical context for AO3. And it's well known that the Duke of Ferrara couldn't produce an heir to his fortune, so he couldn't have children. So therefore, the expensive artwork and sculpture that he collects is the only thing that he can truly ever own. It's the only legacy that he can leave behind when he dies. So that's why he's become so covetous, so greedy for these material objects that show his wealth, because he can't actually have a child to continue his name and carry on that legacy. So, in the absence of genuine love and affection, he seems to want and crave all of these material possessions. Now, another material possession or another possession he tries to own are his wives. But we can see with Lucrezia that these attempts to control and own these women are completely in vain. They're completely pointless. If you wanted to talk further about power, you would comment on the imperative verb notice, which indicates that the Duke is used to commanding those around him and exercising authority. It also suggests that he's wishing to draw attention to his material wealth, and that's possibly to make up for and conceal the insecurities that he's got about his own personal qualities. So we know by now that structural comments can actually elevate your grades. So if you wanted to look at the line, all smiles stop together, we can see by the use of the full stop there in the middle of the line that Browning is using a caesura, and that sets a very ominous and sinister mood because it implies that he had Lucrezia murdered and wiped the smile off her face for good, because that full stop in the middle of the line indicates that after that point she could no longer smile anymore. So this phrase could actually be read as a euphemism for her death. So it's like a less harsh way of implying to us, or we infer, that she's no longer around. So you might also argue that the Duke is an equivocator, and if you're unclear about what that word means, equivocation is actually when people use ambiguous language, so language that's deliberately unclear to hint at something, so they're not direct in their speech. And lots of powerful people, particularly politicians, use equivocation as a tool of manipulating people. You might also want to talk about how that caesura is quite abrupt in the middle of that line. So it implies that the Duchess's smiles and her happiness were also ended quite abruptly and unexpectedly. Now, therefore, the caesura can be seen as a volta, a turning point, because after that point, the Duke's attentions immediately turn towards his prospective wife, the wife that he wants in the future. So he can very easily forget about his previous wife, showing how little genuine feeling he actually had for Lucrezia. Another structural point that you might comment on is the fact that the poem is a dramatic monologue. Now, a monologue is where we only hear the voice of one speaker, which in this case is the Duke. And that just proves how arrogant and self-obsessed he is, because we only ever hear his voice and his biased version of events. So finally, moving on to the tone of the poem, we might want to look at the quotation, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. And that's quite a long quotation, but you would select relevant words such as gift, for example. Now, we can see then that Browning uses a metaphor there to suggest that the Duke is appalled and disgusted by what he sees as his ex-wife's ingratitude. She was ungrateful for the name, so his name, that she actually gained by marrying him. Now, we and Browning can see that this is supposed to be read ironically, because we can see that he doesn't treat his wife well at all. So, irrespective of his status and who he is, he doesn't actually treat her properly, so he doesn't really deserve her gratitude in any way. Now, we can really stretch this and we can analyse the noun gift, because a gift is interesting because it implies that it's something given without expectation of getting something in return. So it's something you do out of the kindness of your own heart. However, it's clear here that the Duke actually expected something back from Lucrezia. He expected complete submission to his control in return for his name. So therefore, he's absolutely disgusted that Lucrezia seems so dismissive of it and so ungrateful. And she actually seems more grateful to receive the bough of cherries some officious fool gives her in the orchard. Now again, that irony is missed by the Duke, but we can see and we can understand why Lucrezia might prefer these small, genuine, romantic gestures of other suitors, other men pursuing her. So being given a bough of cherries is a little bit more thoughtful than being married and then expected to be grateful for a name that you've been given. Now it's also, to stretch it further, worth considering the connotations of cherries and how they're linked to virginity. So it's implying perhaps that the Duke's anger is mainly motivated by sexual jealousy. So he feels that he is being cuckolded, which means that his wife's cheating on him sexually with other men, and perhaps he's a little bit insecure that he's not meeting her expectations. And one of the indications of that would be his inability to get her pregnant, and that would make him feel quite insecure and quite sexually jealous. So it's quite ironic because this very powerful Duke is actually quite impotent, and impotent is another word for somebody lacking in power. So to summarise the key power of man points being suggested by Browning, he seems to imply that power can be and often is abused by mankind. It often causes arrogance and delusions of omnipotence. So that means people think they're all powerful when they're not. It can also be linked to wealth and status, incorrectly so in most cases. And finally, power can make some people feel invincible or untouchable, so that they can get away with things like having their ex-wife murdered. Therefore, some of the bigger issues that Browning seems to be addressing would be political and financial power, power giving people immunity from justice, so making them feel like they're above the law, the theme of pride, arrogance and greed, and finally the theme of patriarchy, so men having excessive power compared to women. For those of us aiming for a grade 7 or above then, we know that we can add additional comments about structural techniques to get higher marks. So we've already said that this poem is a dramatic monologue. Now within this dramatic monologue, iambic pentameter is used in each line, which is lines which have 10 syllables. Now, iambic pentameter is supposed to imitate and indicate natural speech patterns. But ironically, the Duke also speaks in rhyming couplets. Now that suggests that his words are actually planned, they're contrived. He's thought about what he's going to say and rehearsed it before saying it. And he chooses his words very carefully. Now that is despite claiming in the poem that he has no skill in speech. In fact, it would seem quite the opposite, quite the contrary, that he's got this ability to manipulate language. Now that makes him seem like a classic politician, firstly, but it also makes him seem disingenuous. So he's untrustworthy. We don't believe what he says. We can't take it at face value. It's artificial. So when we hear this account of his wife's behaviour, we would have to call into question how valid his point of view is, because he's clearly a manipulator. Moving on to our second poem then, Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. The title is also quite good for analysis. So a bit of background on the poem. It focuses on the discovery in 1817 by an Italian explorer of the remnants of a statue of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II in the desert. Ozymandias then, the title of the poem, is actually the Greek name for Ramesses II. The poem itself was written in friendly competition with Shelley's friend, who was also a poet, called Horace Smith, and he too wrote a sonnet, a 14-line poem like Ozymandias, with the same topic and title. Now, the poem deals with the concept of human power and how impermanent that power is, meaning that it doesn't last. So after we die, that power is lost. Now, the statue of the pharaoh, which was actually commissioned by Ramesses II himself, has been ravaged by time and the forces of nature in the desert. So the sandstorms have eroded it, and eventually it's crumbled back into the desert, metaphorically implying then that no matter how much humans try to immortalise themselves and make themselves live on forever, it's impossible. So perhaps then the poem is Shelley's way of suggesting that Ramesses II's arrogance and pride was misplaced and misguided, because eventually the desert reclaims the statue and the memory of Ozymandias disappears into oblivion, and that's symbolised by the decaying statue. If you wanted to make links to historical context, you could talk about how Shelley may have chosen to use the ancient Greek version of Ramesses II's name because ancient Greek has greater connotations of antiquity, meaning it's an antique language, so it's no longer in use in the modern world. Ancient Greek, that is. And that's suggesting that the pharaoh's power is now obsolete. It has absolutely no relevance to the modern world. So you ask any modern person and they're unlikely to know who Ramesses II was. Or Ozymandias, indeed. So Shelley also refers to the statue being found in an antique land, again suggesting that it's not just old, it's actually completely irrelevant and almost forgotten. Moreover, in ancient Greek, Ozy means heir and Mandius means mandate, implying that Ozymandias wanted to rule over everything, even the air. So he thought he was all-powerful, omnipotent. And the lone and level sands mentioned in the poem, which stretch far away, are symbolic of the remoteness of the statue. So it's not near any human settlements, and that symbolically suggests that it's not actually relevant to modern day life at all. So its demise and its sinking into the sand is going unnoticed. So if we look at the words that Shelley uses in this poem, we can see that he uses words like frown, sneer, and command. So there's a semantic field of language linked to tyranny, so ruling over a country but doing it in a non-democratic way, so doing it unfairly and cruelly. So he ruled with an iron fist. So that means that he will have been known for striking fear into the hearts of those who served him, fear rather than respect, and that would ensure that they remained loyal and submitted to him. So if you wanted to stretch it further, you could look more at the noun sneer. Now that noun implies that Ramesses II did not return the respect that perhaps some of his people did have for him. Instead, he seemed to regard them as inferior to him and almost like they should be grateful that they can bask in his glow and grovel at his feet. It almost implies that he was mocking of them and that he disapproved of them, and that's reinforced by the frown. So whenever they tried to please him, he would return that with a frown. So he's a hard master. He's also clearly being presented by Shelley as a tyrant who gives these commands. So he's not democratic, he's not benevolent, he just orders people around. Now, if you wanted to link that to historical context, you might reference how throughout history tyrants have attempted to immortalise themselves in art. So they're desperate to leave a legacy behind themselves after they die. And that desperation is motivated by vanity and arrogance. So they want to be remembered. And we can see that through leaders like Mussolini, the Italian dictator, who commissioned statues of himself to be put up all over Italy. And these statues depicted a very tall man, which was ironic because Mussolini was actually quite short and he was quite insecure about it. In the same way, Hitler owned a huge collection of artwork in an attempt to seem civilized and cultured, when actually we all know that behind closed doors, Hitler was masterminding some of the most horrendous and most uncivilized and barbaric atrocities imaginable. So these men often use artwork and culture to seem civilized when indeed they're not. So for Ramesses II, he tries to preserve his power and authority in the colossal statue, which is a manifestation of this dominance that he thought he had. And that's the same as the Duke in My Last Duchess, who owns the statue of Neptune. So they both think they're godlike. Okay, so if we move on to looking at the imagery, we can see that Shelley uses a metaphor when he says that the image of Ozymandias is stamped on these lifeless things. And that suggests that Ozymandias attempted to leave an impression or an imprint of himself on nature by having his image carved out of stone in order to preserve that memory of him after his death. However, stone naturally erodes over time, and inevitably that makes the features of the statue less distinct and identifiable. And that symbolises Ozymandias' decline into oblivion and how people will have forgotten him. If you wanted to stretch it further, you could look more at the verb stamped. Now it suggests that he wants to leave his mark on something, implying that he wants to make an impression on civilization. He wants to be remembered as being a leading figure, a legacy that could live on after his death. However, there's some irony here because the materials upon which he leaves this mark are inanimate, they're non-living, and they're subject to decay. And that in itself suggests that human power is transient and fleeting. It doesn't last, in the same way that the Duke's power won't last because he cannot produce an heir. Now, Shelley describes the statue as being a wreck, and that implies that nature has reduced that statue to a mere relic of the past, so it's got no meaning to anyone in the modern world. Again, some other quotations that you might use to add to these points are trunkless legs of stone and the fact that the statue is half sunk and it has a shattered visage, a shattered face. And that's all symbolic of the deposition or the overthrow of Ozymandias' power. So the statue has literally fallen over in the desert. And metaphorically, that is linking to the fact that his power has been overthrown by time and nature, and the desert is reclaiming the stone as its own. Okay, so there are some really good structural points that you can make about this poem, and if you use the quotation "nothing beside remains" followed by the full stop, you can see there that Shelley is using a caesura or a volta, and that caesura in the middle of the line implies an abrupt end to Ozymandias' power and influence. Now, the fact that "nothing beside remains" is a simple sentence also suggests that there will be no recovery or resurrection of this statue, or indeed Ozymandias' power. So his reign is over, it's complete, and it can never be restored. If you wanted to stretch it further, you might talk about how the caesura also acts as a volta, because there's a shift of focus from the statue and its very grand claims before that full stop, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," etc. And then after the volta, after the full stop, it focuses on the surrounding desert and the vastness of the desert actually dwarfs the relatively insignificant statue, particularly because the statue is actually sinking into the sand. So it's no longer this very grand feature in the middle of the desert. It's actually quite insignificant and goes unnoticed. And the boundless and bare sands which stretch far away prove how detached Ozymandias' reign and his legacy is from the modern world. Now, if you wanted to say more about structure, you could talk about how the poem is written in sonnet form. Now, a sonnet is a 14-line poem with a strict rhyme scheme, and it's usually about love. Now, Shelley seems to have deliberately taken that sonnet form and subverted it. He's undermined the conventions of that typical Petrarchan sonnet. And he's made this poem about self-love and egomania rather than about loving somebody else, which is what most sonnets usually focus on. Now, most typical sonnets follow a very specific rhyme scheme. Ozymandias starts off by resembling that rhyme scheme, but then it deviates from it in the final 6 lines, the final sestet, and they follow no set rhyme scheme, no set pattern. So perhaps Shelley is suggesting through this that despite Ozymandias' best attempts to cling on to control and power, ultimately it eludes him, it escapes him. And that's symbolised by the fact that the rhyme scheme is lost towards the end. So finally, moving on to the tone of the poem, we would use the quotation, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." So we can see through despair and look that Shelley is using imperative verbs here to suggest and reinforce that Ozymandias was tyrannical in his style of leadership. So he was arrogant and he gave out these commands and orders. However, there's something quite pathetic about these claims on the inscription on the statue, because Ozymandias no longer has any followers. Now, if you wanted to stretch it further, you could talk about how Shelley's tone seems to be quite cynical about the endurance of human power. So Shelley seems to accept that whatever efforts we make within our lifetimes, there are limitations on how much of a legacy we can actually leave behind after we die, because nature takes its toll and time passes and people get forgotten and their power becomes irrelevant. So the claim that Ozymandias makes here, that he's King of Kings, and his reference to the mighty, it almost seems a bit blasphemous, a bit offensive to Christianity and to God, because he seems to be challenging and assuming this godlike status. He thinks he's omnipotent, all-powerful, when in fact he was only a man, a mortal man. So the imperative verbs look and despair demonstrate that supreme arrogance and pride that he had, that misplaced arrogance. In summary then of the key power of man points suggested by Shelley, we might say that the power of mankind is transient, so it doesn't last, and it's limited by our mortality, the fact that we die. We might say that power gives some people delusions of grandeur, so they think that they're more important than they actually are. And powerful leaders are often blasphemous by assuming this godlike status, so they think that their power can rival God's, which is misplaced. And then finally, it seems to be suggested that nature and time will always be victorious over man when competing for power. So that actually links to several poems, doesn't it? So the weakness and the powerlessness of mankind compared to nature. So some of the bigger themes and issues that Shelley seems to be addressing would be that nature is the supreme power in the universe. It seems to broach the topic of the limitations on mankind's power. It deals with the theme of mortality and immortality, and finally the themes of pride and arrogance. To stretch even further then, for those of you going for a grade 7 or above, you might want to look at the sound devices or the aural imagery used by Shelley in the poem. So in the phrase boundless and bare to describe the sand and the desert, plosive B sounds have been used to perhaps illustrate the aggressive power of the sands eroding that statue. So during those sandstorms, they have contributed to the demise of the statue. Now also, after this phrase, boundless and bare, enjambment is used, so the line continues on into the next, reflecting the seemingly never-ending expanse of desert that stretches out into the distance, again making the statue seem quite insignificant in comparison. You've also got the phrase lone and level to describe the sands, and the use of consonants there with the repetition of that L sound adds a fluidity to the description, emphasising again just how far this metaphorical sea of sand stretches out into the distance, dwarfing that statue which is sinking away beneath the surface of the desert. Okay, so as usual, I've written a sample paragraph in response to the question, how do poets present the power of mankind in My Last Duchess and one other poem of your choice? Both Robert Browning and Percy Bysshe Shelley choose to focus on the concept of human power in their poems My Last Duchess and Ozymandias. In both poems, human power is presented as having its limitations, mainly due to the fact that humans are mortal, so their influence can only be felt for a limited time, usually during their lifetime. In My Last Duchess, for example, Browning presents the arrogance of the Duke of Ferrara, who commands an envoy to notice Neptune, though, taming a seahorse. The metaphor here implying that the Duke regards himself as godlike, comparing himself to Neptune, god of the sea, with a whole dominion of underlings at his service. The irony, however, is that the Duke is, unlike Neptune, mortal, so no matter how much he attempts to control those beneath him in his lifetime, his power will be defunct once he dies. Effectively, he will become powerless, and without an heir to continue his legacy, he is acutely aware of his long-term impotence, hence his desperate collection of objects which will outlive him. Similarly, in Ozymandias, Shelley presents the power of the Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II, as being transient, despite his best efforts to preserve his legacy in the statue found in the desert in 1817. When Shelley observes that nothing beside remains, the caesura indicates that Ozymandias' power was ended abruptly upon his death, and the simple sentence here adds a sense of finality. The caesura also acts as a volta, shifting focus from the decaying statue to the surrounding desert, whose boundless and bare and lone and level sands stretch far away, suggesting the statue is relatively insignificant when compared to the vastness of the desert. Therefore, Shelley seems to be implying that nature and time are far more powerful than any humans, and any attempts to leave our mark on nature will be eroded away into oblivion. So hopefully you can see there how all of the assessment objectives are addressed again. So it deals with the understanding of both poems, human power and its limitations. We've got our quotations, which are well selected. We've got our analysis of methods, which incorporate language methods, imagery, and structural methods. And we've got links with both poems to the historical context. Okay, so we should have seen these top tips plenty of times before. So just to pull out the key points, talking about structure and sound will elevate your grade if you do it successfully. Don't worry if you feel more confident about one poem than the other. That's fine, because you don't have to write an equal amount on them. And remember that if you're talking about AO3, make sure that it's not a history essay and that instead you make relevant links between the poem and its related context.